Welcome to EPG Pathshala program. Myself Meenal Katarnikar, Associate Professor from the Department of Philosophy, University of Mumbai. This session is the problem of psychologism in Indian logic. In this session, we are going to discuss how the problem of psychologism arises particularly in the Nyaya theory of Anumana and the defense of Indian contemporary thinkers of this problem. So, let us go to see what is the problem of psychologism and how it prevails in the Indian tradition. Indian philosophy, or rather epistemology, is often charged to be a psychologistic rather than logical. So, this is the charge of psychologism on Indian philosophy in general. The problem of psychologism is in the context of Indian epistemology and logic, and it is multi-dimensional problem. Let us see what are the facets of this problem. One major dimension is related to the nature of knowledge. The Western theory of inference presupposes the concept of propositional knowledge. Validity and or soundness of inference are possible because knowledge is essentially regarded to be propositional. As we know, this is a fundamental difference between Western theories of knowledge and Indian theories of knowledge. The definition of knowledge given in Western tradition, knowledge as justified true belief, is essentially connected to the propositional knowledge. As against this, in the Indian tradition, knowledge is not regarded as propositional but is generally understood as a cognitive episode. So, inference in this sense becomes a series of cognitive episodes. Here the question arises as to how we can talk of the validity or soundness of such a series of episodes in the sense in which the words are used in logic. So, in simple language, how do we decide the validity of inference if it is going to be the series of cognitive episodes which are essentially mental or essentially internal? Let us see how Indian philosophers respond to this. But before that, let us see the second aspect of the problem of psychologism. Another aspect is related to the relation between or among the premises and the relation between the premises and the conclusion. In inference for oneself, that is Swarthanumana, as the Nayayikas understand it, there are four cognitive episodes that occur in a definitive order. One episode is the cognition of probans in the locus. So, to use the example, smoke is perceived at hill. Second episode is the recollection of pervasion. To say this, wherever there is smoke, there is fire. Third episode, the cognition of probans qualified by pervasion, which is known as paramarsha. So, the smoke on the hill is the one caused by the fire. And the knowledge of the probandum in the locus, this is the fourth episode, where it is confirmed that there is fire on the hill. In this series, the earlier cognition is the cause of the next cognition. Hence, the relation among these cognitions is supposed to be that of causal necessity rather than logical necessity. So, inference for oneself or even the syllogism in the Nyaya tradition is a series of causally necessitated statements rather than logically bound statements. Inference in this way becomes a psychological process rather than a logical one. Now, what are we going to discuss in this session? These reasons are responsible for the charge of psychologism in the Indian tradition. There are some contemporary scholars like Matilal and Mohanty who have tried to defend Indian logic and have tried to show that in Indian tradition also there is logic and it is not merely psychological. So we are going to discuss the problem in two parts. In first part, we are going to discuss the context of knowledge in general. Here we will discuss mainly how Professor B.K. Matilal distinguishes between knowledge as disposition and knowledge as episode, and how knowledge as episode is relevant to Indian epistemology. In the second part, we will discuss how the question of psychologism arises in the context of logic in general and Indian logic in particular. Throughout the module, we will mainly focus on the contributions of B.K. Matilal and J.N. Mohanty, who are the contemporary scholars in the field of Indian logic and epistemology. Now, what is the origin of knowledge, or what is the initiator of knowledge? We are all rational human beings who have the ability to know. So we cognize the things, but our concept of knowledge takes articulation only with the concept of doubt. And this is what is said by the epistemologists, that the skepticism or raising a doubt about the episode of knowledge or the possibility of knowledge is the beginning of any theory of knowledge. No project of knowledge can be initiated unless there is some kind of uncertainty about the thing to be known. In the Nyaya tradition, this uncertainty is called Samshaya, which B.K. Matilal prefers to translate as doubt or debate. The unique feature of doubt is that it is not a state of no knowledge. There exists a subject about which there is no specific knowledge, but at the same time there is certainty about the existence of the subject, which is called dharmin. To formulate it, we may say that we see an object X, but we are not sure if X is A or B. Here A or B are the probable qualities or properties of X. The program of philosophy in this context is to construct a complete certainty based upon the available minimal certainty. However, such construction must be on the account of theory of evidence, that is pramana. It is for this reason that Matilal lays stress upon the pramana method, a method that offers ground and justification for such construction. Knowledge is often said to be a disposition or a mental episode. In the Western tradition in general, knowledge is understood not as an emergent momentary psychological state. It is understood in a more static sense, what is conventionally taken as justified true belief. Here Matilal calls intersubjectively communicable item. This is the dispositional character of knowledge. Such knowledge can easily be put in a propositional form. So we will have to see why Indian logicians preferred to give more importance to the episodic character of knowledge, that is emergent awareness, rather than the propositional form. Belief and knowledge are always connected in the concept of knowledge, but Professor Matilal avoids the use of the term belief, which can be true or false for some obvious reasons. According to him, the use of the term belief would be misleading, as the term is never used to refer to a mental episode. It is rather a static state and can be discarded, confirmed, or contradicted. A cognitive episode is momentary, not a static, and any further reflection, recollection, or examination of it would be another episode. Knowing does not mean being in a spatial state of mind, rather, it is a derivative of some cognitive episode. The other major difference between belief and knowledge is that one may have a belief unconsciously, but to have knowledge, one must have a cognitive awareness, that is a mental episode. So the focus of epistemological inquiry and analysis with regard to knowledge is centered around its episodic character in the Indian tradition. But that leads us to a question: when does the cognitive episode lead one to knowledge, or when a cognitive episode itself takes a form of knowledge? Every cognitive episode cannot become knowledge. That is obvious. To elucidate this point, Matilal uses a metaphor. So we will quote, "A cognitive episode is like shooting at the bull's eye. We take shots at the bull's eye. Some of them hit it and some others miss. But the general idea behind taking shots is to hit. A cognitive episode tries to hit at the truth. If it is successful, it becomes knowledge. It may fail, but the purpose of the enterprise is not to fail but to become a knowledge episode." In this process of the episode converting itself into knowledge, the concept of pramana can help us. We all know that pramana is regarded as a means of knowledge or itself as a type of knowledge, but it can also be regarded as the evidence or the method of knowledge. Let us see how Matilal is interpreting the term pramana. Pramana, in the sense of instrument of knowing, helps generate a knowledge episode. Pramana, in its instrumental sense, is the main factor. The ambiguity of the term pramana allows it to be taken as evidence or criteria out of context. But pramana is fundamentally a causal factor, the most reliable means as well as evidence for the resulting knowledge episode. This is confirmed by Matilal, where he elucidates the above fact by giving an example. In one's perceptual knowledge that this is a table, the most relevant causal factor is the visual faculty, and the same faculty could be regarded as evidence for a person's perceptual knowledge that this is a table. So the same pramana operates as the instrument as well as evidence in any knowledge episode. In this context, it would be interesting to refer to Prashastapada's analysis of the nature of mental episodes. Prashastapada, a Vaisheshika philosopher, has listed 6 foremost mental episodes: cognition, that is jnana; pleasure, that is sukha; pain, that is dukkha; desire, that is ichha; repulsion, that is dvesha; and effort to act, that is kruti or yatna. They are fundamental as, according to him, they trigger further episodes. Just to see this example, cognition of an object joined with other episodes such as it gives pleasure leads to a desire for the object and further the effort to possess it. This is how the mental episodes interdependently operate. The basic character of a cognitive awareness is that it is always an awareness of something. That is, there cannot be a blank awareness, howsoever imaginary referent may be, though there are controversies in the Indian tradition about the above account. To be noticed without the fail that the cognitive episode or cognitive awareness is always intentional. It is awareness of something and it is not just awareness. The episodic nature of our knowing is not much in the dispute. What is in dispute is whether these episodes amount to knowledge or events of knowledge. Here we will see how Nyaya justifies the concept of episodic knowledge. For Nyaya, as soon as the awareness is over, our knowledge disappears. The Nyaya and also Buddhist reply would be that after a particular moment of awareness of something, one retains memory impressions. These impressions can be called knowledge, knowledge of that particular cognitive awareness, on the condition that one's memory does not fade away. In simple terms, the moments of cognitive awareness, which are the moments of veridical perceptions, deliver knowledge. After these deliberations on the episodic nature of knowledge in the Indian tradition, let us see the interface between the episodic view and Western philosophy. We must be aware that the episodic view is not totally unfamiliar in the Western tradition. As Plato mentions in his Theaetetus, the view of Theaetetus, namely knowledge is perception, represents the episodic view. The same view is to be found in the Protagorean doctrine, man is the measure of all things, and also in David Hume's rejection of an enduring subject. Some modern philosophers have differentiated between mental acts and acts of judgment or verbal thought. The inner occurrence, which is referred to as cognitive event, may not be acceptable to some types of philosophies of mind. But the Nyaya Vaisheshika treats both inner and outer occurrences in a similar fashion by calling both effects or karya and bring them in a general category of cause and effect, karya karana. The reason behind it is that there is no substantial difference in the process of cognition of either of them, that is cause and effect. Let us go to the relation between logic and psychology, because we are discussing the problem of psychologism in Indian tradition. Both of them, namely logic and psychology, are concerned with thoughts, but in different ways. Logic is primarily concerned with how we ought to think. It prescribes rules of thought. Psychology is concerned with how we do in fact think. In other words, psychology is concerned with the process of thinking and logic is concerned with the product of thinking. Another scholar in the contemporary times, Mohanty, paraphrases the latter, the product of thinking, as an atemporal structure, no matter who arrives at it or by what process. In this situation, the theories of Indian logic and inference, that is logical and epistemological both, have serious intrusion of psychology, both have substantial interface. What is psychologism? Psychologism is generally perceived as the mistake of identifying non-psychological with psychological entities. More explicitly, Mohanty puts it as a view that theoretical foundations of logic lie in psychology, that ideal logical thinking, being but a species of thinking in general, must be governed by the same laws that hold good for all thinking. On the background of this psychologism, or rather charge of psychologism, let us read the psychologistic arguments. A psychologistic argument reduces so-called necessary truths of logic to mental facts. The following example will clarify the ways of such arguments. Premise 1. Psychology is defined as the science which studies all kinds of laws of thought. Second premise. Logic is a field of inquiry which studies a subset of all laws of thought. Therefore, logic is a part of psychology. Another example. Premise 1. Logic is the theory of judgments, concepts and inferences. Second premise. Judgments, concepts and inferences are human mental entities. Third statement. All human mental entities fall within the domain of psychology. Therefore, logic is a part of psychology. This argument has been criticized. In the West, Frege, Husserl, and Russell were the main opponents of psychologism. They see psychologism at fault in seeking to derive the laws of logic from the way the human mind works. Their main argument against psychologism was that psychologism reduces the necessary truths of logic to inductive and probabilistic laws of psychology. They believed that the entities with which logic deals could not be privately owned, temporally individuated particulars, and that logical truths are not inductive generalizations. All such criticism of psychologism is based upon the presumption that psychological entities are private and subjective. They do not occur as per any principle, whereas this is not the case with Indian treatment of knowledge and logic. What is the psychological question? What is the problem in Indian logic pertaining to psychologism? The basic problem that Indian systems of philosophies have faced is that if they take the episodic view, how can knowledge be universal, shareable, and objective? In the case of logic, how would logic acquire the required generality if it concerned itself not with propositions or statements and their logical relations, but with the private inner affairs of a person? This is the main problem. This charge was raised by J.N. Boshinsky. The crux of the charge is very simple. First, if a cognitive episode is temporally individuated particular, which for many philosophers is incurably private, then we resign to the philosophical psychology of an idealist. And secondly, if the objectivity of knowledge is denied in favor of the subjective mental occurrences, then since the given or datum would remain immanent in psychological temporality or psychological episode, how could we even start any intelligible or communicable discourse about knowledge or perception? There are some attempts to answer this charge. Matilal, representing the Nyaya view, gives an example that if a person witnesses a car accident, can report or narrate the incident for a judge under oath that he has knowledge of the accident. Thus, the proper veridical perceptions always deliver knowledge. For Dinnaga school, pure sensations are claimed to be cognitive in character. Matilal defends the case of mental episode because each observable psychological behavior is invariably preceded by some event of the inner world. Most cognitive episodes are verbal thoughts in the sense that they can be verbalized. It is apt to portray the alleged private and subjective episode as equivalent to some expressed or unexpressed verbal episode. In the Nyaya tradition, acts or episodes like thinking, speaking, hearing, and understanding are taken as homogeneous in their content with some verbal thought or other. Matilal maintains that though Indian philosophers and logicians do not operate with the notion of a proposition, each cognitive episode, though unique as an event, has a structure which gets expressed in a linguistic utterance, and by virtue of that structure, it differs from another cognitive event. In the capacity of that structural nature, there can be the avoidance of the charge of psychologism or private episode in the Indian tradition. J.N. Mohanty sees the inferential process as a sequence of psychological events which nevertheless yields prama. He formulates the inferential process as follows. For any knower S, if S has a perceptual cognition and then remembers the rule, wherever there is F, there is G, as instantiated in the uncontroversial case O, and then perceives in X the same F as before, but this time as figuring in the remembered rule, whenever there is F, there is G, then S will experience an inferential cognition of the form Gx, provided there is no relevant hindrance. Given such an idiotic psychology of cognition, one can have a theory of inference which is indifferently a logic and psychology of inference, but which is not psychologistic in the pejorative sense. Let us summarize the discussion of psychologism in a concluding remark. We must have observed that episodic view of knowledge is not a weakness of Indian philosophy, but it is a feature. Indian systems of philosophies present cognitive episodes in a well-defined structure, and accordingly, a cognitive episode carries with it a generic character. Each cognitive episode bearing a linguistic correlate, that is potential verbalizability, and having a structure enters the public or interpersonal domain and acquires the needful objectivity. Some modern logicians regard the whole debate as outdated in the sense that different ways of mental functioning, of which knowledge and reasoning are parts, are widely covered by psychological theories. Epistemology and logic have but to take recourse to them. The questions of psychologism are subsumed in the contemporary debate pertaining to philosophical naturalism. But to know more about these debates and to know more about what is meant by psychologism and how Indian philosophy is free from that psychologism, one has to refer to the original write-up and also to the sources that are mentioned at the end of the write-up. Thank you.